So David, you're describing trends that, particularly in the last 3.5 years, have changed America's relationship to the world.
Yeah.
But the way I hear you talk about globalization, it suggests that some of these things also are structural and some of these things are political. And so I wonder how much of this you think is a Trump story, how much of it is more broadly American story about the changing shape of America's economic interaction with the world in particular. And how much might change, for example, if Vice President Biden is elected president of the United States? How much does the president matter, and how much of this is just a trajectory that the United States has been on?
What is uniquely Trump is that Trump has brought the United States to this rising confrontation with China more or less alone. Another president might have tried to build a series of partnerships, coalitions to confront China, as President Obama did with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as a President Hillary Clinton probably would have done, and as a future President Biden will do. But as you say, the path toward a more difficult relationship that had already started simply because of the rise of Chinese power. Americans are not used to dealing with a peer country. I don't think Americans have had to deal with a peer country since the demise of the British Empire, and then the United States. Then it was just a much more intimate relationship than the Chinese-American relationship could ever be. But whatever would have been different if somebody else had been president, Donald Trump is going to bequeath to President Trump's successor two areas that make trouble more likely in the future than otherwise would have been. And one of them is the gigantic debt, and the other is the American military establishment. Let's talk about the second first. President Trump increased defense spending over the level bequeathed by President Obama by approximately $100 billion a year, even as U.S. military engagements tended to come down during the Trump years. What did that extra $100 billion a year buy? Well, some of it went to buy paid for higher salaries and more benefits. Healthcare, of course, the United States military is as hit by rising healthcare costs as anybody else. But a big chunk of it has gone into preparing for conflict with China, and specifically for naval conflict with China. President Trump, early in his presidency, was shown a map of these militarized Chinese islands in parts of the South China Sea, and those images upset him, and he then began to order plans to do something about it. He also wants to spend more on nuclear weapons. And he's putting us on a path where the military is thinking about China not just as a competitor, but as an enemy. Now, the next president will probably have more easygoing personality and more peaceable intentions. But the fact is the capacities have been built, and military capacities have a way of driving decisions. What you can't do, you don't do. What you can do, you might do. And we're in a situation where the possibility of actual armed conflict between the United States and China is even more feasible than it was in 2015, or at least would seem feasible to a policymaker in a crisis. So that is a real risk. The other risk, and one that will, I think, affect American thinking for decades, is the gigantic legacy of debt that is going to be left by the Trump presidency. And this is even before the pandemic. The United States was on the verge of running perpetual deficits of $1 trillion a year in good times, and with no shooting war. Now we're going to have deficits much bigger and a debt much bigger. We're probably going to be facing the level of debt that we faced after the Second World War. But unlike after the Second World War, I don't think anybody thinks there's a prospect of rapid economic growth that will at least grow the economy so the debt to GDP ratio becomes less burdensome, as it rapidly became less burdensome in the 1950s. Debtors and creditors tend not to get along very well. And while more of the American debt is owed to Americans than people think, the Federal Reserve, the Social Security system, China is a major debt holder for the United States, and that is going to be a source of pressure, conflict, and friction between the two countries going forward.
So I'd pick up on that. So that raises an interesting issue, which is what I would call the securitization of the U.S. China relationship. What's interesting about the U.S. China relationship is that there's been military and security competition and political and ideological competition from the very inception of the modern U.S. China relationship. If you think about it, the origin of this relationship really is in President Richard Nixon's visit to Beijing in February 1972. And at that point, the United States and China were fighting a proxy war in Vietnam. And China was still crawling its way out of the Cultural Revolution. So from the very beginning of this modern relationship, there were these deep military and security differences and deep political and ideological differences. But particularly over the last 25 years, the central characteristic of the relationship is that economics and security have largely proceeded on separate tracks. And so there was a theory of the case that I think a lot of people in both China and the United States had, that economic integration would mitigate security competition and obvious differences of political system. But the United States and China, they've become enormously integrated economically. You have a $700 billion two-way trading relationship. You have more than $100 billion of US foreign direct investment stock in China. In 2016 alone, you had about $50 billion worth of Chinese deal flow into the United States. You have hundreds of thousands of students and scholars and tourists going back and forth. But despite all that economic integration, not only has the security competition not been mitigated, but if anything, it's getting worse, as you say, in places like the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. But now, and this is really the central point, the relationship is being securitized because those security differences are bleeding back into the economic area. So the things that connected these two countries, the flows of goods, capital, people, technology, are being refracted on both sides through the prism of their security competition. And both sides are choosing to undertake unilateral, retaliatory, or reciprocal policies that reflect that military dynamic and really are cutting them off from each other. So in the goods area, for instance, you have President Trump's love of tariffs and China's reciprocal and retaliatory tariffs. In the area of capital flows, you have all of these restrictions now in China on flows of American capital. American companies face across and behind the border barriers every day to competition in China. They really don't have a level playing field. And now you have the United States cracking down on Chinese capital flows here. You have the Trump administration weaponizing visa policies and China doing the same. And really at the center of this is the cutoff of flows of technology. Because increasingly, rather than seeing opportunities for co-innovation, even around things like vaccine development in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, you have people on both sides viewing technology as a zero-sum contest. And so really we're entering an era of what I would call techno-nationalism instead of techno-globalism. And this has the potential to be very disruptive in the first instance of the U.S.-China relationship, but over time of a lot of the ways that the global economy has evolved, or particularly over the last 20 years since China went in the World Trade Organization.